I had some offcuts of oak veneered MDF. These were salvaged from some library bookshelves, and I'd previously used this stuff to make these bedside tables and also the shelves for this display cabinet that I restored recently. Both of those projects were other videos on my channel. I wanted to use up this material and I figured out I had just enough to make a small record box. The pieces had a few screw holes in them and some old biscuits sticking out of the sides, so I began by cutting away those pieces on the table saw. I wanted the corners of the box to meet at mitre joints so that the end grain of the MDF would not be visible. So I swapped out my table saw insert for one with a wider slot and then tilted my blade to 45 degrees. And then I used my panel cutting sled to rip one side of each of the panels at 45 degrees. Then I measured from the blade and made a mark on the sled, which I then transferred to the fence on the sled, the width I wanted these panels to be. I could then use this mark to make repeated cuts to make sure that my panels were the same size. So here are the 4 panels that would form the box. Next I took both the side panels and marked up 10 cm in from the back of them, lined up my speed square with that mark and made a 45-degree line. I then set my mitre saw to 45 degrees, lined up the blade with the lines I'd marked up and made the cuts. At this point I realised I'd made a mistake. You can see here where the mitre joints would meet the front panel. This would make edge banding the panels very difficult because of the angles. But it wasn't a difficult problem to solve. I simply marked up a 90-degree cut from the front edge that was the same measurement as the thickness of the boards, and then marked up another 45-degree line from that mark. I then recut the diagonal piece on the mitre saw and finished off the cut on the bandsaw. This sort of mistake happens when I'm building something on the fly rather than drawing plans for it first. Next I could mark up the height that the front panel would need to be. I then set my table saw fence to that measurement and ripped the panel to size on the table saw. I could then start assembling the box. I used wood glue and some of these corner clamps to hold the box together. I then added a couple of ratchet straps around the box and a few F-clamps, being careful not to apply too much pressure to move the joints while the glue was still wet. I'd use a piece of this 5mm hardwood plywood for the bottom panel. I cut it to size on the table saw and then added glue, wiping away any excess from the inside of the box so that it wouldn't affect the finish that I'll be adding later. The outside of the box didn't matter so much as I was going to be scraping off and sanding away the old varnish and refinishing it anyway. I marked up screw positions and then drilled pilot holes with a countersink bit before adding some 40mm drywall screws. Next I'd make some edge banding and trim pieces for the box using this piece of mahogany. I thought about using oak for this to match the veneer, but I chose mahogany for a more interesting look. Here's a good tip. Ripping very narrow strips of wood that are consistently sized at the table saw between the fence and the blade isn't particularly safe, so what I did here was set up a sacrificial fence on the opposite side of the blade. Then I can move the fence to push the workpiece up to the sacrificial fence before making each cut. This way I get strips that are exactly the same thickness and it feels much safer. And I remove the block with a gentle tap with a mallet and no cleanup required as the hot glue sticks more to the wood than the table saw top. I added the strips to hide the MDF edges. These were offered up, marked up, cut to length and glued in place, and I used masking tape to hold them until the glue set. The edge banding for the diagonal pieces needed to be cut at 45 degrees so that it would mate with the next piece of banding nicely with no gaps. Next I started to remove all of the old varnish from the veneer using a cabinet scraper. I later sanded at 120 grit. There wasn't really anything wrong with the old finish, so I could have left it as it was, but I prefer a wax finish, which I'll be adding later. I sanded the edge banding and it looked really nice once sanded. I did a bit of cleanup work with a chisel and with a block plane. Then I did some hand sanding at 240 grit. I eased over the sharp corners too, just to make them more comfortable to the touch. Then I added some more of the mahogany trim pieces to the bottom of the box to hide the plywood edges on the bottom panel. Ordinarily I would have cut a housing groove to accommodate the plywood bottom in the box, but in this case I didn't want to lose any height to the box, as the width of these panels was already a good size for the height of the box. Because mitered MDF glue joints are not likely to be particularly strong, I decided to add some dowels to the side of the box just to reinforce the corners. The dowels will also make a nice decorative feature which I like the look of. I marked up the position of the holes and drilled them using a brad point bit. Then I could add wood glue and insert the dowels with a mallet. I wiped away any excess glue and then used a flush cut saw to trim off the excess dowel. And after some hand sanding, they looked great. For finish I chose this antique pine brie wax. This pops the grain in the mahogany and oak quite nicely. I really like wax finish for pieces like this that don't need to be particularly hard wearing or resistant to liquids, so I use it a lot. Finally, I added my maker's mark to the bottom of the box, which I later sealed with some spray varnish. This project took around 10 hours in total. I'm really happy with how it turned out. Here are some pictures of it with a few of my records inside. This project was mainly just about using up some leftover material that I didn't have any other use for. I keep all my records on a shelf and I have too many to fit in a box this size. This one will hold about 45 records in total. This record box will be listed for sale on my Etsy store. Check it out if you haven't already. There'll be a link in the description box below this video. Thanks for watching.